Good evening, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, coming at you for another of our live videos hosted on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine Facebook page. You'll also be able to find this video a little bit later on YouTube as well. First off, Happy New Year, everybody. Hope everyone's 2021 is off to a good start. As you can see, we are still doing these videos in 2021. We're going to continue doing these videos, hosting live programs as well as pre-programmed, pre-scheduled programs across our digital platforms, even as we hopefully in a little later this year get back to some normalcy in terms of programs and doing things as the museum would normally do them across all three of our sites. I hope all of you are having a great New Year's Day so far. It is very rainy here in the nation's capital. Rain is pounding against the windows as I'm doing this program from my apartment. Very excited to be talking about some Civil War history on this New Year's Day. It is appropriate to be talking about the Battle of Stones River, or Battle of Murfreesboro, on this day as we are commemorating the 158th anniversary of this particular battle. So that's what I'm going to be discussing today. Very excited. Myself and the other staff members at the museum are excited about doing more Western theater programs this year. It's kind of a goal of ours. We do have some very cool collections in the museum that are related to Western theater battlefields. So we are excited to begin to kind of step out of the Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania theaters and do more on what is happening elsewhere in the Civil War when it comes to medical care. If you are enjoying these programs, if you have seen them in the past, you've heard this before. But if you're watching here for the first time, thank you so much for tuning in with us today. You can help us in a couple of different ways. You can support the museum by clicking that like button. You can help us by clicking the share button as well. You can add in your comments where you're all tuning in from today. That allows us to know where our visitors, our digital visitors, are coming from. But you can also help us and take your support to the next level by becoming a member or a donor to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We are having an ongoing fundraising campaign called Support Hope Through History. You can find information about that particular program in the comments section as I post it right now. Hopefully, there it goes. You can support the museum by donating at the link that I just put into the comments section. That is going to go directly to supporting our efforts, supporting the museum. We are closed at the museum until at least January 15th to all tours, all visitors. We may open up again for visitors through January and February. Stay tuned to our website for more information. So you're helping to support the museum during these difficult times as we're dealing with this pandemic by going ahead and donating. It doesn't have to be a lot, $5, $10. I know y'all are getting some, hopefully getting some stimulus check money. Please consider putting the museum into your contribution list of organizations that you are seeking to help at this difficult time for our country and for the world as well. As I mentioned just a bit earlier, today's program, we are going to be talking about the Battle of Stones River, Murfreesboro. I have had very little familiarity with a lot of Western theater battlefields. Myself and John Lustria, who many of you are probably familiar with, we're talking about how we haven't done a lot with Western theater battles. And so if you go ahead and look at our website, civilwarmed.org, which I'm a little biased, but I think it's a great website with lots of great resources available. If you look on our events list there, you will note that there is quite a few more Western theater themed programs than we've had probably at least since my time at the museum, which is at least 7 years. So we're really excited to get into more geographically diverse topics to talk about some of these other battlefields, which have fascinating medical stories, which are much more complicated and complex than a lot of what's going on in the East, only because there's not the same resource and attention being paid to some of those Western battlefields where, in many ways, the Civil War is won and lost. And so we're really excited about doing more of those programs. I see lots of you tuning in and hanging out in the comment section. We do appreciate that. Feel free to have conversations going on there. That's also there for you to ask questions. However, as the program is going on, I won't be able to see the comments as we're presenting. So if you do have a question or a comment related to something specific, please add that to the comment section. And when I get to the conclusion of my brief presentation today, we'll go back and look at the comment section and answer any of those questions. We have had this question in the past as well. You will be able to watch this program after we are off live. You can watch it here on Facebook. It will stay here in the video section of the museum's Facebook page. The video will also be uploaded to YouTube as well at the conclusion of the program in the next couple of hours. So a couple of ways you can watch us and watch this full video if you're only able to catch a bit of it. These videos do stay online. All right, so I have lots of folks tuning in from all over the place. I see Fredericksburg, Virginia, Pittsburgh, PA, Indianapolis, near my hometown of Halifax, Pennsylvania, Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to flip over now. Reminder, I won't be able to see the comment section, but if you do have questions, please go ahead and ask them in the comment section. We're going to go over to PowerPoint now. Voila, I'll jump right into things here and start talking about the Battle of Stones River, or the Second Battle of Murfreesboro, depending on your persuasion and how you go ahead and name your battles during the Civil War. This engagement was fought December 31st to January 2nd, December 31st, 1862 to January 2nd, 1863. This battle always throws me off because it's really hard to kind of write that out, that it occurs over 2 different years. It occurs over the New Year's holiday. So it always makes it a little difficult for me to talk about it, to also to write about it. These 2 armies that are going to be fighting on the outskirts of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, are going to be the Army of the Cumberland under General William Rosecrans, and the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate Army under General Braxton Bragg. Fighting does occur over 3 days, although most of the heaviest fighting is done on December 31st, 1862, New Year's Eve, and then some more fighting going on January 2nd of 1863. In the end, it results in 12,900 casualties for the Union Army, 11,700 Confederate casualties. This is a pretty bloody engagement. In fact, these armies are significantly smaller than the armies we see operating in the Eastern Theater. These armies are both less than 50,000 men. So the fact that they suffered such severe casualties shows that this is one of the bloodiest, one of the deadliest battles of the Civil War, if you were actually in this particular battle. So the casualty figures on paper don't look that big compared to some of the other battles, but when you count how many participants are involved, the percentages are significantly higher. So if you were at this battle, your chances of being wounded or killed or captured were higher than a lot of other battles that are going on during the Civil War. 15,000 wounded are going to need to be cared for through this, in the aftermath of this particular battle, during and after. And when we get into the medical organization, this is where there's a big difference when we look at the eastern side of the Civil War. When we start to go out west, there's not a lot of the same medical development that we're seeing in the east. It's a little bit slower in a lot of these western armies. And we see that in the Army of the Cumberland. In particular on the Union side. It is a mishmash of brigade level medical department command, division level, corps level, and then you have these additions at the end of 1862 in both the east and the west of these so-called grand divisions, which is pulling together multiple Army corps. All of these different units have their own medical directors and medical leadership, and it is a mess, and it is hard to understand for a historian such as myself trying to familiarize myself with some of these different units. So all of this to say, if I make any mistakes, please bear with me. Let me know in the comments section. I am exploring these 2 armies in depth for the first time with this presentation. So bear with me, still learning here, but there's a lot of fascinating detail to come from this particular battle and understanding kind of the evolution of medicine during the Civil War. A big difference, another difference here in these Western theater battlefields is to see that there's very little pre-planning being done medically for these engagements. We're going to see that in this particular battle. But there is some evolution, some development beginning to happen with an ambulance corps in Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland. And this is an ambulance corps taking the ideas of people like Jonathan Letterman and other medical thought leaders on the northern side and adapting them to the Union armies operating outside of that Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania theater. So we are seeing, this battle will see one of the first utilizations of a makeshift temporary ambulance corps in some of these Western armies. So they're beginning to break away the ambulances and move them out of the quartermaster department, commissary department, into the medical department of this particular army. So you're going to hear a little bit about that in some of the reports that are done. And as for the medical infrastructure, which we talk quite a bit about in our programs, because it is so crucial to understanding the medicine given and administered during these battles. You need to understand where these armies are operating from and where their supply lines are to, and ultimately those links back to medical locations, infrastructure, hospitals, where those sites are going to be. So for the Union Army, that is going to be Nashville, Tennessee, which is going to be their base of operations for this campaign in December of 1862 and January of 1863. Confederate Army, they're going to have their lines ultimately all end up going back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that's where a lot of their wounded are going to end up after this battle. So that's kind of the laying of the land. Let's dive in here. And we'll start off with this photograph, this gentleman here, which I was very excited as I was preparing this program to find this photograph in the collections of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So we have this photograph. This is medical director Ebenezer Swift. He was the medical director for the Army of the Cumberland during this campaign. And he is going to be the person responsible for the Union Army's medical response at this battle. And he talks a little bit about some of his pre-planning that he did for this battle, knowing that the armies were going to be moving out of Nashville and heading south and east to engage Confederate forces, which ultimately ends up being the Battle of Stones River. He talks about this in his report. This is what he says about some of his pre-planning. He says, quote, "Before leaving Nashville, I had approved of full and complete requisitions at the suggestion of Surgeon Murray, U.S. Army, my predecessor, for the 3 grand divisions of the Army. I had also in reserve tents, bedding, etc., for a field hospital for more than 2,500 men, which I ordered up from the rear on the 29th. As soon as I learned the enemy had made a stand near Murfreesboro, at the same time, I ordered forward 20 ambulances, all that we had on hand at Nashville. Surgeons were detailed to perform operations when decided on after consultation for dressing and such other duties as reception and disposition of the wounded and circumstances required." Just for comparison's sake, 20 ambulances, that would be the reserve of ambulances. Each of these units, brigade, division, corps, grand division, will have their own ambulances. But the fact that there are only 20 ambulances available in the U.S., in this particular U.S. Army's reserve, again suggests that the lack of resources that you have in other theaters and with other Army organizations at this time. It's Jonathan Letterman's going to have hundreds, in some cases, in 1863, hundreds of ambulances available in reserve. So there's a little bit of a resource strain that Ebenezer Swift and other surgeons in the U.S. Army are going to deal with in this particular campaign. So he's talking a little bit about his medical pre-planning. When looking and researching at this, trying to figure out what the Confederate pre-planning medically for this battle, there is very little written, and very likely knowing from other battles as well, other campaigns, there's very little medical pre-planning that the Confederate Army is doing. They're putting a lot of their focus and emphasis on putting their troops where they need to be, using the topography, the terrain. There's not going to be a lot of the medical pre-planning. That's not in the forethought of their strategy as they're preparing for military campaigns. We see much more of that on the northern side during the Civil War. So Fighting is going to actually break out as Ebenezer Swift is just getting to this part in his report, December 31st, 1862. Now, these two armies are maneuvering, Union forces coming out of Nashville, Confederate forces moving kind of north to engage them. They do run into each other, and both Bragg and Rosecrans kind of both come up with the same idea that they're going to turn the right flank specifically of their foe. Braxton Bragg's Confederate forces are going to get the jump on Rosecrans's army, though, and they're going to launch an all-out assault on the Union Army's right flank. Their right Grand Division is going to take the brunt of a massive assault on New Year's Eve, 1862. This is going to cause utter chaos in the Union lines. They are ultimately going to hold, eventually, after many of these units are going to run a very long time after breaking as Confederate forces are attacking them on New Year's Eve. The problem with these lines breaking and running, and we're seeing some of that in this particular illustration, is that they run so far that their hospitals are going to end up getting caught in the middle, and in some cases completely and entirely overrun. So Confederate forces are going to push so quickly and aggressively, and their attacks are going to be so successful that they're going to gobble up most of the field hospitals that are associated with the right Grand Division of Rosecrans's army. We do get some insights into that from the report of Dr. C. McDermott, who was the medical director of the 14th Army Corps. He's also the medical director of the Right Grand Division. See, this is where some of the confusion is going to come in. He writes about this experience of having all of these hospitals overrun and how you're going to manage those. This is what he says, quote, "When it became evident that the territory occupied by our hospitals would fall in possession of the enemy, I directed a sufficient number of surgeons and attendants to remain in charge and not to desert the wounded in any event. These officers were exposed to much danger as the contending armies swept past, but they remained faithful at their posts and were unceasing in their attentions to the wounded during the 3 days that elapsed before the recovery of this territory by our troops. The enemy took from them a large portion of the medical and hospital stores and instruments, and our own men were compelled to seek for dressing materials and bedding among the families of the rear of the lines. Much kind assistance was received from citizens in the vicinity, and no violence was experienced at the hands of Confederate soldiers." So this is a pretty common situation as Confederates overrun a Union field hospital or medical facility of any sorts. Medical supplies were at a premium in the Confederate Army, and those are going to be among the most prized things, prized items that Confederate soldiers and Confederate medical personnel can get their hands on, or all these mostly well-stocked larders of Union medical departments, hospitals, ambulances, etc. So this is pretty common and normal to see this. And you hear him then commenting that there was no violence done on the part of Confederate soldiers to the Union wounded and also the medical professionals who are caring for them. So that's the situation that we see going on December 31st, 62. During this beginning of the Battle of Stones River. Now I want to take a look at what the experience was like for a wounded soldier. There's a really great account from a soldier in the 6th Ohio who is going to get swept up as Confederate forces are sweeping through and are rolling up Union forces, especially during the morning and into the early afternoon of December 31st. Ebenezer Hannaford of the 6th Ohio is going to be wounded during the course of this fighting. So we're going to see his perspective here. He wrote the unit history for the 6th Ohio and has a very descriptive writing of his own wounding during the Battle of Stones River. This can stand in for a lot of the experiences of wounded Union and Confederate soldiers during this battle. This is what he says, quote, "I remember no acute sensation of pain, not even any distinct shock, only an instantaneous consciousness of having been struck. Then my breath came hard and labored with a croup-like sound and with a dull, aching feeling in my right shoulder. My arm fell powerless at my side, and the Enfield dropped from my grasp. I threw my left hand up to my throat and withdrew it, covered with warm, bright red blood. The end had come at last. Or so Hannaford thought. He actually crawls into a grove of trees. He's among kind of big boulders, and he finds a spot where he thinks he's going to make himself comfortable to die, and he falls into unconsciousness. This is that particular soldier. This is Hannaford a little later in the Civil War, but this is the soldier that we're talking about. He looks for a comfortable place to die. He falls into unconsciousness and then wakes up. And he is going to kind of look around and decide, well, I'm still alive. Maybe I'll go and find my way to a field hospital. And that's going to be a situation. This is a sketch from 1863 from a soldier who served in the Army of the Cumberland, kind of drawing the aftermath of a battle. It's from the Library of Congress collection. And this is what Hannaford says, kind of his next steps. Again, this is a good stand-in for the experiences of Union and Confederate soldiers at Stones River if they are wounded. Some of the sights they would have seen, the emotions they felt, the physical sensations that they would have had after having been shot in many cases. This is what Hannaford writes. He says, quote, "Reluctantly leaving my blanket, my haversack and canteen as a prize for some fortunate rebel, I wandered away back toward our lines. Across those corn and cotton fields again, now strewn with the dead and wounded, our own blue and the rebel gray mingled together, heedless alike of the piteous calls and prayers from every side for the assistance I could not give, and of the perils of shot and shell whistling past me. And at last I reached the turnpike, faint and exhausted. A little further down, I came to a little low log cabin with its strip of red flannel fluttering before it to indicate its present use. Its two small crowded rooms crowded hours before with the wounded and dying, and scores more sitting or lying around smoking fires on the outside. Ambulances were coming and going, freighted with their precious burden of maimed and helpless humanity. And still the wounded were accumulating constantly. I remember the almost hopeless weariness with which I sat down before the fire to wait my turn for removal, when a familiar voice called me. It was one of my own company, who had escaped this morning's ordeal of fire by a fortunate detail of a few weeks before on the Pioneer Corps, and whose kindness to me in this hour shall have an abiding place in my remembrance. He took off my cartridge box, of which I had in vain tried to unburden myself, cleared for me a better place by the fire, rolled up a barrel for me to rest against, and as soon as possible procured me a seat in an ambulance. Then, with such feeble thanks as I had strength to give him, we were driven off. The road was blockaded with troops and confused masses of artillery, ammunition trains and ambulances, and stragglers, singly or in fragmentary squads, skulked about everywhere. The afternoon was waning fast when we finally reached the field hospital of our division, which had been established the day before, about 5 miles back from Murfreesboro. It was a motley collection of tents, hospital, Sibley, wall, bell, flies, anything indeed that could be found and made to afford shelter, pitched in a promiscuous heap in a large open meadow, sloping up from the turnpike off to the left. No one could direct us to the hospital of the 6th Ohio, and I was little able to go farther, so a place was presently made for me among the comrades of the 90th Ohio, where I found needful care and rest at last. So this is, again, a good description of what is going on for a wounded soldier to experience during this battle. The conditions, they are fighting in Tennessee. It's kind of northern Tennessee, though, and it is winter. And sleet and slush and freezing temperatures are going to be a major issue. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit as well for those who have been left out on the battlefield. Now, a Confederate soldier in the 34th Alabama simply described what he saw as he was detailed as a nurse in a Confederate hospital. After this first day of fighting, he says, quote, "We had no leisure, night or day. The house was filled by wounded and kept filled. As fast as one could die and be carried to his grave, another was put in his place." So again, the conditions in this particular battle, as they are with many battles during the Civil War, are particularly brutal. Those added kind of temperatures and other conditions from this particular battle are going to make this battle very well remembered by those who participated in it. So that cold and misery left many of the wounded who went uncollected overnight to die of exposure or of their wounds while still laying out on the field. Most of the fighting after December 31st, Confederate victory that day, but they were not able to completely break the Union Army, as is the case in many of these battles. One side cannot quite push the other to the breaking point. And the Union Army is going to coalesce and come together in a newer, stronger position that is going to be pretty much unassailable, as Confederate forces will find a little later on in the battle. New Year's Day, 1863, the work of the surgeons and medical personnel goes on, but no major fighting is going to take place until we get to January 2nd. As Confederate forces are going to make another assault, it is ultimately going to fail and is going to lead General Braxton Bragg to make the decision to withdraw his forces for fear of General Rosecrans and his Union Army getting reinforcements. So this shows an illustration showing some of that fighting, some of the wounded soldiers, and the nature of the combat that is actually going on. So I'm going to flip over here. I've been talking a lot about the Union side. I'm going to talk a little bit about a Confederate surgeon, although he wasn't actually, his chief work wasn't as a surgeon in the Confederate Army. He was actually a chaplain. This is Dr. Charles Quintard, the 1st Tennessee volunteers. And he gives us an account from his memoir after the war to give us a description of what he was doing during the Battle of Murfreesboro, as he will refer to it. And this is what he says. He is working as a doctor at this point. He is a chaplain. He's a reverend. He is much more kind of religiously inclined than he would prefer to do that work than do some of the surgical work during the war, though he's going to kind of end up doing both of those, as his memoir will relay. This is what he writes. He's going to do some work after the January 2nd, 1863 fighting, and this is what he says, quote, "As the wounded of the 1st Tennessee were brought in, they always called for me, and it was my high privilege to attend to nearly, if not all, of the wounded of my regiment. Some of them were desperately wounded. Among these was Bryant House, nicknamed among the boys Shanty. He had been shot through the body. The surgeon into whose hands he had first fallen told him that it was impossible to extract the ball and that there was no hope for him. Well, send for my chaplain, he said, doubtless thinking that I would offer up a prayer in his behalf. Instead of that, however, I went in search of the ball with my surgical instruments and was successful. Shanty died in September 1895. He was, for years after the war, a conductor on the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway, and took great delight in telling this particular story. So a kind of account, we're going to come back to Quintard in just a bit. He has a good description of kind of the aftermath of this battle from the Confederate medical perspective. But ultimately, what is going to happen is Bragg, as I mentioned before, is going to withdraw his forces, kind of leave the field in control of Union forces. Union soldiers, Union Army will go back and reoccupy, go back to their old field hospitals that they lost. And they're also going to have to deal with the dead. This is another illustration showing particularly grisly. This is an illustration of a soldier who was on the battlefield at Stones River, who took a look at some of the wounded and, in this case, dead Confederate soldiers and sketched them. But this is the scene that would have been presented to any soldier, Union, Confederate, who went onto the battlefield, seeing the dead laying out on the field, many of whom had been wounded and lied out there without anybody coming to get them. So this is particularly, again, horrible, terrible scene to witness. And the Union Army in this particular battle is going to have to deal with burying all of the dead. And they're going to leave behind some descriptions of what they are witnessing. Those who are on burial detail or who see these wounded and then ultimately dead soldiers out on the battlefield. Here are some accounts. Quote, "At 0100 by the light of the moon, we dug a grave and laid to rest poor boys gone where there is no fighting." Another account. Quote, "The frost, the dead and dying, and the dark cedars among which we bivouacked were wild enough for a banquet of souls." And one last, more descriptive one. Quote, "9 were lying in cold death near us, awaiting the simple, unceremonious burial accorded to a soldier on the field of battle. Some looked as though they had just fallen asleep, eyes closed, hands at their side, countenances unruffled. Others appeared as if their last moments had been spent in extreme pain, eyes open and apparently ready to jump from their sockets, hands grasping some portion of their garments and their features all distorted and changed. It was a sickening sight to look upon or contemplate, and one from which a sympathetic heart would quickly turn away." So that those dark accounts aside, we have to pick up the pieces after this. And so this is going to be how the Union Army and the Confederate Army are going to deal with evacuating their wounded soldiers away and getting them to proper medical treatment in actual medical facilities. So let's start off with the Confederate forces. Confederate side, they're going to retreat away from Murfreesboro, going to head to Tullahoma, Tennessee. Ultimately, they're going to get hooked up on the rail line to Chattanooga. And Chattanooga, Tennessee is going to be where many of the wounded from the Battle of Stones River, Murfreesboro, are going to be sent in the aftermath of that particular battle. Dr. Quintard actually is going to go on that trip with a wounded soldier. So he provides a great bit of detail of what that experience was like. So this is what Dr. Quintard writes. He says, quote, "I continued at work in the hospital located in Sewell College, that is in Murfreesboro, or was in Murfreesboro, until the Army was about to fall back to Shelbyville, when I was sent for by General Polk, who asked if I would go to Chattanooga in charge of Willie Huger, whose leg had been amputated at the thigh. He was placed in a boxcar with a number of other wounded men, and I held the stump of the thigh in my hands most of the journey. When we reached Chattanooga, I was more exhausted than my patient. I remained with him for some time." So this is a bit of the scene that we would have if you were a wounded soldier making the trip from Bragg's army ultimately to Chattanooga to permanent medical facilities that had been established there. That's what you would be expecting. Boxcar, you'd be lucky if you get somebody like Dr. Quintard there to kind of help you deal with your wounds, to be there to support you, to help you. It's not going to be the case for a lot of the Confederate soldiers who are going to go through this experience. And even when you get to Chattanooga, the situation kind of escalates out of control. We get a view of this. And this is something that oftentimes happens after Civil War battles. We don't always get such descriptive views of what this is like. This is a particularly interesting newspaper article that comes from the Chattanooga Daily Rebel from January 8th, 1863, so about a week after the battle, and its wounded are pouring into Chattanooga. This is what the editor of the Daily Rebel had to say. It says, quote, "We have received a note from the excellent surgeon of the post at this place, Dr. S.H. Stout," that's Samuel H. Stout, "to the effect that the surgeons and ward nurses of our hospitals have become well nigh exhausted with their unceasing labors of the past half week. We trust that our citizens, whose patriotism and philanthropy are proverbial, will immediately come to their relief. For a week, night and day, they have labored with no cessation, and unless those who are able to assist will speedily come forward, our hospitals and their unfortunate inmates will be in a deplorable condition. Men and women are wanted to nurse, to sweep, to cook and wash, and to bathe the wounds of the sufferers. Anyone who can and is willing to do these things, anyone who can carry food or water or lift a litter, can do their country an incalculable service. I have never known," remarks Dr. S., "men who work more faithfully than the hospital attendants at this place, and they deserve some relief. We can testify to the accuracy of this communication ourselves." Night after night, we have seen the kind surgeons and their equally kind assistant at the depots, busy in their attentions to the wounded arriving by the trains. A little system on the part of our citizens in rendering aid will not be oppressive to anyone, nor will the necessity exist longer than a week if the complete prostration of the corps can be avoided. Under normal circumstances, the medical corps at the hospitals is sufficient to keep the establishment in order. But on the heels of a terrible battle, where so many brave and patient sufferers are borne from the field to our very doors, shall we idle and apathetic? Forbid it, heaven. It will never be said that the people of Tennessee were wanting in that hospitality and humanity which has ever characterized the citizens of our state. We are satisfied that our noble, generous countrywomen need only to be assured that their gentle ministrations are needed by the suffering heroes of the late battle in defense of their homes to enlist their sympathies, heart and soul in the good work. Many a poor fellow from a distant state, away from the kind care of mother and sister, is without that attention so necessary to the comfort of the invalid. So lots of parallels in that article to what's going on, unfortunately, in many of our own hospitals and medical care facilities today as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But you can see a hospital system completely overwhelmed by the number of wounded and asking desperately for help. This situation would ultimately, of course, as the wounded stop pouring in, would improve, and as citizens do come together to help those people, those medical professionals and also the patients themselves by donating supplies, their time, and the efforts to try to make their lives a little bit more bearable. Again, this is all made worse by the wintry conditions that are going on at this time of year that adds to the misery of just about everyone as a result of this situation. Now let's go over to the left side. So the right side of this slide is a wartime image of Chattanooga, Tennessee. On the left, this is a photograph from the Library of Congress that shows a church in Murfreesboro that was one of the many buildings that was going to be used as a hospital in the wake of the battle. So the situation's not much better in Murfreesboro, which is going to become a familiar term to all of us with Civil War Medicine Museum, one vast hospital as a result of the battle. This Murfreesboro is really going to be used as a large hospital depot, kind of because of the circumstances of this campaign. Confederate cavalry commander Joseph Wheeler is wreaking havoc behind Rosecrans's army, kind of cutting off the army from its supplies at Nashville. And so this is a condition that is going on during the battle and is going to plague the Union Army. So they can't really evacuate. There's concerns about evacuating their wounded back to Nashville immediately for fear of those wounded soldiers being captured, the ambulances stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And so Murfreesboro becomes basically a large hospital for these soldiers before they are ultimately transferred back to Nashville. There is a description by a newspaper of the day that describes what Murfreesboro looks like at this stage, which is a pretty good description of what it was like for one of these communities to kind of be absorbed by the military and be used as a hospital. This is something that happens. I'm sure stories, you are all familiar with these, Gettysburg, after Antietam in Frederick, Maryland, our hometown, and many other places where Civil War battles take place. This is what this newspaper correspondent writes. Says, quote, Murfreesboro is one vast hospital, nearly every house having more or less wounded in it. The farmhouses for miles along the various roads are also used for the same purpose. Every residence almost has been surrendered to the unrelenting genius of war, who spares nothing in his relentless career. The Federal and rebel wounded are placed promiscuously together, and doubtless it would not only be curious but instructive to listen to their conversations. Now, this author does not go into any of those conversations they may have heard in these hospitals, but nevertheless, it would be curious to know what these wounded Union and Confederate soldiers were talking about as they're being treated side by side right next to each other. So that's the condition kind of in the aftermath of this particular battle. I'm going to end the formal side of this presentation with a bit from Ebenezer Swift. So we'll go back to this photograph from the collections of the museum. And he goes into a little bit of analysis of how the battle went and ultimately how some of these new innovations that are being integrated into the United States Army, into their medical department during this campaign, how those were utilized, and ultimately how there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made and won't officially be made part of all Union armies, all US armies until 1864. And that's the Letterman system, the ambulance corps, those things that we talk about with Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg that aren't going to get to the Western theater in kind of an organized fashion until March of 1864. But this is what Swift writes in his report, which is from January 25th of 1863. He says, quote, "The ambulance corps, though temporarily organized, worked admirably. As soon as the fire of the enemy slacked at any point along our lines and became only desultory, the ambulances dashed in at a brisk trot and snatched our wounded from their picket lines. In justice, I should add, the enemy did not fire on these brave men when they knew their humane mission, friend and foe, no longer combatants, being equally the objects of their care. I am gratified to say my conservative views were generally adopted and that the amputations were seldom performed without consultation. Many exceptions were made, which are doing well, and some cases were treated as compound fractures with marked success." This goes to, in the second year of the Civil War, the medical care is kind of becoming more refined. There is more scientific evidence-based medicine being practiced, and there is also going to be kind of steps that need to be taken before any course of surgical action is going to be taken. So we're even seeing that in this in the Army of the Cumberland under Swift's control. He also writes, quote, "I visited the hospitals on the Wilkinson Pike and neighborhood, now again within our lines, and found the wounded generally well cared for. Surgeon Marks and other medical officers, as well as also the attendants left in these hospitals by direction of Surgeon McDermott, medical director of the right wing, I am happy to state, but with few exceptions, did their duty faithfully and well. Their labors were great and harassing and not unattended with danger." That goes, I feel, is a great place to leave this off. Their labors were great and harassing and not unattended with dangers, fits for medical personnel throughout the American Civil War, but in particular at the Battle of Stones River in December of 1862 and January of 1863. All right, so that's going to conclude my formal part of the presentation. So I'm going to bounce on over to the comment section here. It's going to take just a second, see if we have any questions here. So I'm going back to the top of the comments here. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed the video so far, please go ahead, click the like button. I'm going to stop share here. There we go. Please go ahead and click the like button, click the share button. That will allow more people to see the video. If you haven't yet donated to our Support Hope Through History campaign, please consider donating to that as well. All right, so I'm going to go back to questions here. This is from Tamara. Does the museum have a list online of the wounded from the Battle of Stones River? We do not have a list from Stones River. We do have a list from the Battle of Antietam, and the hospitals that were in Frederick, Maryland, which is where we are located. We don't have one for the Battle of Stones River. I'm not sure what resources are available out there. I know that there's a project with the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky in October of 1862, the major battle that precedes Stones River. They are putting a list of their wounded soldiers online from that battle, but I'm not sure about where you would be able to find that particular resource with everyone listed. Unfortunately, we don't have that information readily available in kind of a list or database form. All right, continuing on down here, saying hi to some folks. To Lynn. Hi, Lynn in Catonsville. I hope you have had a great holiday. Hope all of you have had a great Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year. All right, continuing on down through here. Lots of folks tuning in. Got some Michigan, West Virginia, Minnesota, Ohio, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, South Carolina. Does the number of include disease, non-battle injury? No. The list of casualties from this particular battle that I referenced at the kind of opening of the program, that is just battle casualties. That is not counting the non-battle related disease, illnesses. Those don't get counted in the official kind of battle reports, which are all in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, which are available in various places online. Good questions, good questions. Continuing on through here. From Dan, any accounts of wounds freezing and actually saving a man from bleeding to death? I have not come across something so explicit, but there are circumstances that would probably lead us to believe that this might be something that happened. In fact, the wounds that were suffered by Ebenezer, I'm forgetting his last name at the moment, let me go back to my notes, the soldier of the 6th Ohio, Hannaford, his wounds very well maybe have helped, his situation may have been helped by the fact that it was so cold. I'm sure that this was a factor in possibly helping some of these patients, but also is going to be a huge detriment just because of how slow the response was, just because of the circumstances of the battle, as well as the lack of a thoroughly organized ambulance corps and stretcher bearers that we see in other battles. This means that a lot of these guys are going to be left out in the elements, and ultimately, I think it's going to do a lot more harm than it would good. We often hear, this is from Lynn, we often hear of absconding of medical supplies even by raiding parties under the Confederate forces. Is this common with Union troops in the Western theater? I think that, it's medical supplies were valuable no matter what, but oftentimes Confederate field hospitals are going to be, by comparison, less well supplied, especially with the things that were really valued, things like opium in particular. And this is kind of why it was so crucial for Confederates to get their hands on the Union medical supplies, because the blockade of the South is having medical supplies are included. This means that a lot of valuable medications, quinine, opium, are not going to be shipped, are going to be difficult to ship into the Confederacy. And so they're going to be much valued. And this is why we see more stories about Confederate forces raiding hospitals, raiding depots with medical supplies, because they didn't have ready access to that. There were those supplies coming through the blockade on blockade runners, but that was incredibly expensive and very inefficient, and they didn't get enough of what they needed. So to be able to raid that from your opposing force, from the army you're opposing, proved to be pretty beneficial. So we do see that more on the Union side, or more on the Confederate side than on the Union side. What is the exact story behind the sketch? I know exactly which sketch you're referring to. I can go back over to it. So there is a great collection. Let me go back over to our all right, here. Let me pull up the screen because I know which one you're referring to. All right, this one that looks sort of like Zombie Attack. So there is I believe his name is Adolf Garosh, or I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. He's a Union soldier and sketch artist. If you go into the Library of Congress and you actually search, what's written down here is Stone River Rebellion. If you find his artwork in the Library of Congress collection, there are hundreds of illustrations and pieces of artwork that he did over the course of his service in camp, on the battlefield, Shiloh, Chickamauga, Stones River. He is doing illustrations of each of those. It's kind of how he remembered the war, and they are fascinating to look at. This one in particular is pretty gruesome, kind of Halloween-esque, little bit of zombie action going on here, but I think this is meant to show the nature of some of the wounds, and I think that particular soldier may have had his this guy right here, we do know of from photographs of some of the soldiers who received plastic surgery, early forms of plastic surgery, that in some cases when mini balls or shell fragments would strike the jaw, they would tend to rip all of that off as well. And so it's probably likely what he was witnessing in that particular illustration and trying to pass that across. From Peter, why would the Confederate Army spare a surgeon to hold a stump all the way to Knoxville? Was the soldier a VIP? What purpose was served by holding the stump? Makes, as a surgeon myself, it makes little sense. I can't make sense of this one either. It would suggest to me that, and this might be worth a bit more digging into in that particular story, that because he was being asked to do it by a high-ranking officer, a general in the Confederate Army, to accompany this soldier, that he was probably of some importance to General Polk. That's probably the origins of that he would spend all that time with him and take such care to hold a stump all the way back to Chattanooga, where they're taking him, which was not a short or easy railroad ride. I would think suggests that there is some special connection between the general and that particular wounded soldier. Keep on going down here. Ooh, some folks watching from England. Thanks for tuning in. Who claimed the victory? That would be Union forces are going to hold the battlefield, so they're going to claim victory. In the early stages, when Confederate forces were driving very hard at the Union forces, they did telegraph everywhere that they had claimed victory. Ultimately, they did retreat away. It ultimately proves to be pretty indecisive in terms of the kind of the control of Tennessee, but what it really does, kind of in a bigger picture sense, is raises a lot of questions about Braxton Bragg as a commanding officer. And those questions are going to dog him for the rest of his Civil War career and right up to the present day. He's still one of the more controversial figures in terms of battlefield leadership during the Civil War, and his actions and decision making at Stones River, especially after December 31st, really plays a part in that. How many doctors were accounted for from each side? This is a good question. I have not been able to get an exact figure, and this is oftentimes the case. It's comparatively easy to get information about the numbers of men in entire units or entire armies. As it comes to medical personnel, it's actually more difficult, and unless in a report or in documentation that ends up getting kind of put out there, it's very difficult to actually find numbers of medical personnel unless it's related expressly. So you have to actually go and kind of dig into each regiment and each unit, each brigade, division, to know exactly how many medical personnel they have. I have not been able to do that for this battle, nor really any other battles yet. But I will say that, when you start to look and you can actually get a crude count. I don't have it for this particular battle. I'll probably go and look at this afterwards since you asked. But if you look at each regiment and how many regiments participated, generally a regiment will have a surgeon and an assistant surgeon or two. Sometimes they have three. I've encountered that before, and a hospital steward. So roughly each regiment has 3 to 4, sometimes a few more medical personnel with them. So that gives you a count of how many medical personnel are with each unit. So you can start to add that up, and then there are medical staff at in the army of these two armies, at the brigade level, at the division level, at the corps level, and then there's a grand division level, which doesn't actually appear to have any staff or anything associated with it. So you have to go all the way up the chain. I begin to get an idea of how many medical personnel are with these armies. Generally, and I've seen this for larger armies, Union Army at Gettysburg has something, I want to say around 600 medical personnel with them at that battle. So compared to the number of combatants, it is pretty low. These doctors, nurses, stewards would be overwhelmed by the number of casualties that they would have been experiencing. All right, continuing on. Were there any photographers present at Stones River? No. And this is going to be why there aren't that many photographs in this particular presentation today. There are very few photographers who are operating kind of in this vicinity. A lot of the photographs you'll see of the Stones River battlefield are going to be taken after the Civil War. And much of that battlefield is unfortunately been gobbled up by development. There's some great blog articles about this from my friend John Banks. If you want to know more about the Murfreesboro, Stones River battlefields, definitely check out John Banks's Civil War blog. Lots of those, and lots of information available about kind of the battlefield, the landscape, and also some photographs taken after the Civil War. How is this advertised as a historical location compared to, say, Gettysburg? Well, Gettysburg they preserved most of the battlefield. Murfreesboro, unfortunately, Stones River battlefield is a tiny fraction of the original battlefield has been preserved. So unfortunately, a lot of the battlefield has been lost to development. I have not been able to get to this battlefield myself. I'm very much looking forward to getting there. But again, if you read up on some of the preservation stories from Murfreesboro, unfortunately, suburban sprawl has kind of consumed most of the battlefield. When were Hammond's orders for the collection and documentation of wound specimens fully integrated into the Western Theater? Lynn, this is a really great question. I don't actually know exactly when the documentation and collection of these wounds is going to end up at the Army Medical Museum. That's a great question, probably worth exploring on a future program. We're going to be doing more of those in 2021, kind of looking at some of the questions, the great questions you all ask, and trying to answer some of those that we have some trouble with. That is a really good question that I don't know the answer to. And as we're doing more exploration with the Western Theater, we'll definitely clue in on that question. So I will say, Lynn, more to come on that front. Volunteer medical person, is there any example of people pressed into service, some civilians in medical care? Yes, that does happen when people's homes get kind of taken over for hospitals. Sometimes they are willingly helping, other times they are not willing to participate. We'll say this is another topic we're going to be broaching in a program in 2021, and that is in the Confederate Army, enslaved people who worked as medical personnel, who were pressed into service and working in hospital facilities, whether as nurses, cooks, beginning to look into those, beginning to tell those stories and talk more about that. And I think that would fall into your question there as well. All right, well, I've come to the end of the comments section here. So before I sign off, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in today. I hope you all are having a great new year, a great start to your new year. If you did enjoy today's program, you can still help us by liking the video, sharing the video, and I just dropped a link to our fundraising campaign. We have raised more than $10,000 in the last month or so, which is fantastic. We appreciate all of you who have donated already, but we're working towards a $25,000 goal. So every little bit helps. So if you've enjoyed these programs, you enjoyed this program today, please consider donation to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And if you want to support us in a more long-term fashion, consider becoming a member as well. And there's information about membership on the museum's website, civilwarmed.org. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in with us today. We'll be back next week with more programming. Stay tuned to our Facebook page here or our website, civilwarmed.org/events, to find out the next dates of our programs. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.